Hi, I'm Willy Lowry. Welcome to Two Blocks from the White House. You've probably already heard U.S. President Donald Trump has decided to put yet more tariffs on Canadian goods, this time placing 50% tariffs on a broad swath of Canadian exports. We're going to talk about what these new tariffs mean to you and to the U.S. Canada relationship. I hope you enjoy the conversation. Hiya, Mike. Welcome to the podcast.
I'm excited to be here because normally I spend my time writing for the website, and this time I get to use my voice.
And what a voice it is. Mike Crawley is one of our esteemed correspondents here in Washington, D.C. And Katie, I miss you very much. The desk feels empty.
I miss you
the
too,
studio
Willy.
feels empty, though we're happy to have Mike. But you are doing some pretty exciting work right now. Take us through. Where are you and why?
Well, I'm backfilling this week on The National. It's my first time hosting
I've
The
heard
National,
of it.
so it's very exciting. And it's in a very Toronto moment. For those of you who are watching this on YouTube rather than listening on Spotify, I'm going to move out of the way right behind me. See that dark spot in that window out there? That's the CN Tower. So it's very like I'm having a very Toronto experience, and it's a delightful time.
Well, my misfortune of you not being here is the podcast's gain, because it's really good to have you in Canada this week, because we're going to take a look at the temperature and the relationship between Canada and the U.S. It's been a rocky one over the last 18 months, and it had just a few dramatic twists and turns over the last 24, 48 hours. Of course, I'm talking about those new 50% tariffs that are going to be imposed on Canadian exports to the U.S., ordered by U.S. President Donald Trump.
Canada's been very, very tough on us over the years, for many years, and no other president's done anything about it. I love Canada. I love the people of Canada. Many friends that live in Canada, but their leadership, from Trudeau to the current leadership, I mean, in all fairness to them, they need us to survive. Without us, there's no way they can survive. So, but they've been very, very tough over a period of the last 50 years, actually.
Well, the White House specifically says these new tariffs are a response to Canada's discrimination against American auto, dairy, and alcohol industries.
But there is still some time here. It won't be imposed until August 19th. So we will be watching for how each side is going to react in the days ahead.
In the meantime, tension was already ramping up between Canada and the U.S. because of accusations that Canada has been mismanaging forest fires and letting smoke drift across the border, not to mention the fact that trade negotiations have stalled. So this week we're asking, what's up with these new tariffs, and what does it say about the state of Canada-U.S. relations?
I'm Mike Crawley.
I'm Katie Simpson.
And I'm Willy Lowry. We're CBC's Washington correspondents. You guessed it. 2 blocks from the White House, and a little change this week. Okay, so before we begin, I should say that we're recording this episode at around noon on Tuesday, and up until 4 p.m. yesterday, we had a completely different episode planned, more focused on wildfire smoke drifting to the U.S. from Canada and threats of tariffs because of that. But then, Katie, take us through what happened.
Everything changed when an email appeared in my inbox, an invitation from a senior member of the White House communications team, informing me that I was one of several journalists invited to be a part of a briefing phone call. These are normal things. They happen on a regular basis. And depending on the subject matter, that's how different reporters get invited. So a number of Canadian journalists were invited to be on this briefing call, along with a number of American journalists, I believe, from business news outlets. And essentially what happens is a senior Trump administration official speaks on background to reporters and makes an announcement. So in this case, it was an announcement about a plan to change the trade agenda with Canada. Rarely is Canada the subject of these background briefing calls. Oftentimes they're about what's going on with the war with Iran, or other technical issues that the Trump administration wants to be able to sort of clearly state what their objective is and share information with reporters so people don't get things wrong. Really, it's about getting information out as clearly and as accurately as possible. So I was one of those reporters, and I'll never forget, I'm sitting in this call because I'm in Toronto, and I have other duties this week. I'm not necessarily on reporting, and I'm sitting there and I'm listening to what the senior Trump administration official is, and I'm sending email notes to the assignment editor of the National saying, we have a new lead story. We have a new lead story. I have to go on Power and Politics right away. I haven't had my makeup done yet, but this is this all happened so fast. I went on TV without my makeup being done. So that's how quickly this all came together. And I wouldn't normally do that, but I did.
And I was in the call too, listening. Katie got to ask a question to the senior administration official. And one of the things too that's folks who are outside of journalism don't know is that sometimes these things, they're actually given to us a bit in advance of when we're told to report on them. So the conference call started at quarter after 4, and it was embargoed until 5. So I was busy writing the web story and put it into editing, but we couldn't publish it until the dot of 5 o'clock, and it was a pretty rushed period.
How quickly were those fingers moving?
When I realized how big a deal this story was, it was the eyes were pretty wide and fingers were moving quickly.
I won't lie, this all happened while I was commuting home. I picked up my daughter. I thought I was going to have a blissful evening, and then I started seeing your messages, and I got home and said, oh, we certainly have a new podcast subject, because this is really a significant increase from the Trump administration. Before we get there, let's talk a little bit about the basics, Mike. What exactly is this new round of tariffs? How are they going to be imposed? When? And which goods are being affected?
Yeah, the headline number of the tariffs is big. The rate, 50%. It applies to a pretty wide assortment of Canadian products, and the total amount, if you think of it in terms of how much does Canada export to the U.S. annually that's going to be that would be affected by these tariffs, it's about $28 billion worth of annual exports. That's Canadian dollars. Now, the White House's justification on this, they laid it out in 3 presidential proclamations. And they said it's a response to Canada discriminating against 3 U.S. sectors: alcohol, dairy, auto.
Long-standing complaints?
Long-standing in the case of dairy, relatively new on auto, and clearly the alcohol one is a response to those provincial boycotts. Some of the Canadian products that would be hit with the tariffs, because there's these lists, they make sense, right? So milk products, cheese, green, dairy, clearly. And just about every alcohol product you could think of, so wine, beer, whiskey, if you're sending that Canadian Club or Crown Royal to the U.S., other spirits. But then this is where it gets a little weird. So the White House published a list of Canadian products that are to be tariffed to, in their words, offset Canada's discrimination against the U.S. auto industry. There's more than 350 items on the list, and none of them are auto-related. There's these random things: candles, Christmas decorations, fishing rods, hammers, plastic cups, and fake beards. But in all seriousness, these are actual industries that employ people. It's just not clear why the U.S. is tying those products to Canada's alleged discrimination against the U.S. auto sector. There's some significant industries in there too. There's a bunch of wood products like plywood, some paper, pulp, products that come from my home province of New Brunswick. There's an iconic Canadian thing, hockey equipment. So I'm wondering if that's a USA response to elbows up. There's the exemption specifically given to energy, potash, critical minerals. So those things are explicitly not being tariffed. And then the last thing that I want to mention is the actual legal basis that the Trump administration is using to impose this tariff. It comes from a section of an act that is nearly 100 years old, but has never been used by a president before. So Canada's making history. It's the first country to be hit with tariffs from Section 338 of the U.S. Trade Act of 1930.
Yeah, and I was doing a little research on that Trade Act, also known as the Smoot-Hawley Act, essentially created during the Great Depression as a way to try and defend and protect the American economy. At the time, one of the countries that was being targeted was, in fact, Canada, I believe.
And there's some economists that actually say the Smoot-Hawley Act and those tariffs made the Depression worse. The other bit of trivia about the Smoot-Hawley Act, it gets mentioned in Ferris Bueller's Day Off. You know, the boring teacher droning on?
Passed the, anyone? A tariff bill, the Hawley-Smoot Tariff Act, which...
That scene, the Smoot-Hawley Act.
A classic movie. And Katie, let's talk a little bit about what kind of impact these tariffs will have on Canada's exports.
Yeah, so I was speaking today with a senior Canadian government source that has direct knowledge of what's going on to try to get a better sense of what comes next and sort of what is the overall impact. And Mike, you mentioned the number, but the source told me right now the Canadian government is going through the process of trying to verify the estimate right now. It's roughly around $28 billion Canadian in terms of the amount of goods and products that are going to be hit by this new tariff, these new tariffs, if it does come into effect. But one thing that keeps coming up, and almost immediately after this announcement was made yesterday, we were starting to get questions from Canadians about saying, hey, didn't the Supreme Court strike down Trump's ability to do things like this? Wasn't there a court ruling that said, hey, Trump, you do not have the authority to do this? Well, part of the reason why it's sort of an influx situation. So yeah, the Supreme Court did say, listen, Donald Trump, you tried to impose tariffs on an emergency basis. You actually didn't have the power to do that. So the Trump administration went back to the drawing board and looked at all the other tools in their toolbox, if we can describe it that way. And they found this other provision. And so this is another one of those situations where the Trump administration says, okay, is this an option? Let's give it a try. Basically, the justification essentially is that because Canada has retaliated against Donald Trump's initial trade actions, because that took place, that Canada is discriminating against the American economy, against U.S. commerce. And so we deliberately heard the words discriminate from the senior U.S. government official who is speaking to us about this. We've heard it from other members of the Trump administration because they're trying to sort of give themselves that legal base to say, hey, you know what? Canada is discriminating against us. And so we do have the legal justification here. What do I expect going forward in terms of that, though? If it's anything like the last sort of round of tariffs that we saw, I would expect that American business owners or American workers or possibly even maybe a union, who knows, but American companies that say, hey, we don't want to pay these tariffs, we don't think these are justified, they may go to court to challenge the Trump administration. And remember, that's who challenged the Trump administration under those first emergency order tariffs. They're the ones that said, hey, I'm a wine importer based in New York City, and you're going to put these tariffs on these European wines. You're going to kill my business. I also don't think that you legally have the justification to do this. And that was just one of the business owners that came forward to launch that legal challenge. And now even though the Supreme Court ruled against the Trump administration saying, hey, you can't do this anymore. You don't have the power to do this because it's about taxing, and Congress has the power to tax, not you, Mr. President. We're now sort of in the legal process, into the legal weeds about what's going to happen next in terms of, are there going to be refunds? How do people get refunds? Are people getting refunds now? And it's a whole big technical mess that could very much take some time to sort out. And so we could be headed toward another one of those situations again.
So I just want to clarify. You're saying if for that to happen, though, it requires American small businesses to take legal action. That's
small businesses or whoever's going to challenge it, because that's how Canada, the legal recourse Canada could have. They could go to international trade tribunals. They could go to the trade tribunals within the CUSMA structure. But those things take forever. In order to see somewhat faster action or more direct action, typically that's how we see it through the U.S. legal system, through those American companies that are like, hey, we don't think you legally have the justification to do this. Let's launch a lawsuit.
And I was in touch with some trade experts this morning and asking them this specific question is, who would have standing to challenge this particular law in court? And the answer that they gave me is U.S. importers who are who are affected by the move, who are basically the ones that would have to be paying the tariffs on these Canadian products.
Kind of shows you, though, just how difficult a spot, in some ways, helpless a spot that the Canadian government is in.
Yeah, I mean, the Canadian government would be wanting to try and solve this through negotiation, right? I mean, wouldn't you agree, Katie, that it's about really, the positioning and the leverage in the broader talks of around the Canada-U.S. Mexico agreement, that if there's a way for Canada to solve that would be to fend off these tariffs or to get them removed, that's the kind of thing that would have to be sorted out in those negotiations, right?
I think there are a number of things that factor play here. One, I think that Donald Trump fundamentally believes that companies that produce things in North America shouldn't be operating in Canada or Mexico. And he fundamentally wants to take Canadian and Mexican jobs and put them into the United States. I believe that is a genuine thing he wants to do. And he says it out loud. We don't need your cars. We don't need your lumber. We have enough here. And I believe that's an overarching thing there. Yes, ultimately, I think the Americans, well, they've stated it. They want more favorable terms for American companies and American workers. And they have laid that out in public testimony and other decisions that the Trump administration has made. And so as a result of that, that's like another element of this. They want to continue on, but they want the terms to be more favorable. And so American companies can make more money. So American workers can make more money. So more Americans can be employed with good middle class, good income jobs. That's the sort of goal here. And so I think it's a complicated mix of all of that. And I also truly fundamentally believe that based on what Donald Trump has said, he views himself as tariff man. It goes back to the 2024 election when Donald Trump would go on the road and talk about how tariff was one of his favorite words. This is the tool he likes to use. He thinks that other presidents were taken advantage of with all these globalization trade deals. And this is just another element of that. So I think it's deeply layered and there's a lot at play here. And I think that even if Canada goes into these negotiations and sort of the ball starts to move, ultimately it's going to come down to what Donald Trump has to say, not necessarily what Jameson Greer and perhaps Dominic LeBlanc, Jameson Greer being the U.S. trade representative, being essentially the cabinet member in charge of trade versus his Canadian counterpart. I think it's going to come down to Trump and whether he's feeling it.
And I think there is a general consensus among Canadians that however the negotiations proceed, tariffs are going to be part of the deal, that tariffs are...
No matter what.
Are part of the new reality, the new relationship, not just between the U.S. and Canada, but really between the U.S. and the world. But Mike, Trump has been griping about Canada's restricted dairy market for a long time, and certainly for several months over the Canadian province's decision to essentially ban or stop selling U.S. alcohol. But why now? Why these retaliatory actions now?
Okay, good question. Let's hear what Katie mentioned, the U.S. Trade Representative, Jameson Greer. Let's hear what he said. He was speaking to CNBC on Tuesday morning and said basically, well, this is the natural consequences of Canada's actions.
And we impose tariffs on all the world at varying levels. Of all the countries who retaliated against the United States, one was the People's Republic of China and the other was Canada. Some of the things they did is they banned the sale of U.S. liquor and other booze on Canadian shelves. They capped and limited the amount of autos that could be shipped to the United States from companies who were reshoring to the U.S. And they also continue to maintain limited space for market access for U.S. dairy. But importantly, they give other countries better deals on each of these three issues. And so it was a natural consequence after a year of these measures being in place, and longer in the case of dairy, for the president to take action.
Okay, so one of the key things that he said there is about Canada giving other countries better deals on each of those three issues. And that's their definition of discrimination, right? Same goes for dairy. They're pointing to a recent deal made with the European Union related to dairy.
Like so much of what this administration does, elements of truth, but context matters.
Yeah, so that's the ostensible sort of legal justification. But, to that question of why now, because obviously the alcohol stuff's been going on for a year and a half, the dairy stuff has been going on forever, you can't ignore the fact that this is going on at this crunch time for the broader CUSMA talks, and there's an argument that this is a negotiation tactic for the U.S. to have even more leverage in those talks to try to get concessions from Canada. Another thing that's kind of weird about the timing, and I don't know, maybe I'm overreacting to this, but it happened the day after the World Cup final, right? And all I can think of is that it's hard to imagine that is a coincidence, that maybe the Trump administration is like, they wanted to make this move, but they didn't think the optics of doing it when they were co-hosting this gigantic soccer tournament with the eyes of the world on Canada, the U.S., Mexico jointly hosting it. I don't know. But, day after that's done, whammo, Canada gets hit. And then I was just thinking this other thing about the real motivation. Elsewhere in that interview, Jameson Greer, who I've spoken to directly as well, he said this: the number one thing that he says Trump wants to do is reduce the U.S. trade deficit with Canada. Granted, all the stuff that Katie said about wanting to reshore jobs and have more Americans working, that's obviously part of the motivation. But Jameson Greer has said that reducing the trade deficit is a big deal. Well, what's the main reason for the U.S. trade deficit with Canada? It's the imbalance in energy, right? Canada exports a ton more crude oil and energy products to the U.S. than the U.S. Exports to Canada. No tariff on crude oil, right? If you look at what is being hit with these tariffs, I don't want to minimize it, but that $28 billion figure that Katie mentioned is about 5% of Canada's annual exports, the value of Canada's exports to the U.S., right? Is hitting that amount going to actually really reduce the trade deficit substantially? Or is it more about, punishing Canada, getting leverage in CUSMA, trying to do all those other things that Trump wants to do for the U.S. economy?
Katie, you are in Canada. What are Canadian leaders saying today?
Prime Minister Mark Carney says that as of Tuesday morning, he did have a phone call with President Donald Trump, and they agreed that they were going to sort of intensely go back to the negotiating table. But one of the questions, he took a few questions from reporters in Ottawa, and one of the questions sort of related to what comes next. As we've talked about here, one of the biggest irritants is the different provinces imposing their ban on American booze. And the question is, in order to avoid this next round of tariffs, will Mark Carney call on the premiers to get rid of the booze bans? And he gave a little indication of what advice he might give the premiers.
Those measures have been supported by provincial citizens, and they're supported, and it's indicative in terms of other consumption habits, if I can put it that way, of Canadians, where Canadians have traveled. Other things that are on the shelves but aren't being purchased. The decision to change that, first and foremost, will be taken by the provinces themselves, each individually, and should only be taken, in my judgment, as part of an overall agreement. And that's what we'll work to accomplish.
That, to me, suggests that these are perhaps Canada's strongest bargaining chip, at least at this point. We've seen the Canadian government make a number of concessions to the U.S., and those concessions, when it comes to these kinds of big picture negotiations, a lot of the times, some of these programs or things that are announced, the long-term sort of view of them, like think about the digital sales tax, those kinds of things, is they could be useful, more useful as a bargaining chip with the U.S. than necessarily policy. And my other question is, if that's the conversation among the political class and what the Prime Minister is thinking might be coming next, I do wonder what Canadians, the average Canadian consumer, is thinking. If the booze bans end, if you can get a California Chardonnay on the shelf at the LCBO in this moment, in this climate, do Canadians want to purchase it?
That's a great question. Mike and I were having that exact same conversation before we started recording. So, Katie, 2 peas in a pod, or I guess three Ps in a podcast, but
2 blocks in a White House.
But it's a fascinating question. What are the premiers who are, of course, meeting as we record this? Do we have an indication of whether they're going to kind of follow through with Carney's advice and stay strong, or are we beginning to see some fissures?
Well, there's a sense of anger and a sense of frustration that Canada is once again in this situation, and it's perhaps also like a smidge of exhaustion at this point, because I think the reality has set in that Donald Trump likes tariffs. One of the first premiers to speak out once these new tariffs were revealed was British Columbia's David Eby.
There is not a chance in hell that U.S. alcohol is going back on the shelf in British Columbia. And I'm proud of that, and I know the British Columbians support that. And the idea of the president that he can bully us into whatever he wishes is incorrect.
That was pretty clear.
Pretty clear. But I think it also speaks to a little bit of this administration's fundamental misunderstanding of Canada. This is something that they've, you could copy and paste it to a certain extent around the world. But the Trump administration assumes that the people that they're doing business with will essentially roll over. And I think a part of their real frustration over these negotiating tactics, and Trump has said it himself many times, is that Canada is tough and that they aren't.
Yeah, and I also wonder, I think about the domestic politics of it too, having covered Ontario politics for a good long time. It's hard for me to imagine that any premier at this point in time of the 8 provinces that are still upholding a boycott of U.S. alcohol products, that they would gain politically from saying, yeah, you know what, I think it's time to let U.S. alcohol come back onto the shelves.
And Mike, all of this is transpiring right around the time when we were expecting perhaps a declaration of a different tariff, with Trump saying that he was considering placing tariffs on Canada because of these wildfires that the smoke from which have been blowing across the border and into U.S. cities. 2 things. Is that tariff or tariffs still on the table in Trump's eyes? Do we have a sense of that? And kind of what does it all say about the relationship right now?
Right. So the wildfire tariffs, if we call that, was a floated idea. And look, in the past year or so, Trump has floated a bunch of tariff threats that he's either put out on social media or said to reporters and didn't follow through on. So, the big difference this time is that these are in a written proclamation, official proclamation from the president. So, the wildfires seem to be a bit more of a political reaction. It was selling well. There were a ton of Republicans that were making a bunch of noise about it. There's a bill from a Ohio senator, Bernie Moreno, that literally calls for sanctions against Canadian government officials if they don't act to stop the wildfire smoke from coming in.
From Washington.
Expelling the potential to expel diplomats, but also to sanction Canadian government officials, freeze their assets, basically the kind of thing that they do to rogue, regime sponsors of terrorism. Again, this is just a bill, was floated, is highly unlikely to go anywhere, but it's the importance of it to me is the political environment, right? Yeah. It sells well. It seems to be selling, or at least Trump and his allies, the MAGA movement, feel that bashing Canada sells well at the moment. And whether it's about the alcohol ban or the wildfire smoke or Canada's treatment of Wisconsin dairy farmers, it fits into U.S. domestic politics. I think you got to look at it a little bit politically through that lens in terms of the response to the wildfire smoke.
I think those are really good points. And Katie, 30 days, now less, I suppose. What should we expect to happen next?
I would not be surprised if we end up seeing Canadian officials in Washington, D.C., perhaps for some in-person conversations to see if they can get to any sort of agreement to prevent these new proposed tariffs from coming into effect. But and more conversations between Donald Trump and Mark Carney. It's sort of this thing where Canadian businesses are going to have to figure out what is their plan B. What are they going to do if their American clients no longer want their products because they're just priced out of the market? What if these American companies, what if these American buyers are able to find American-produced alternatives that are cheaper? Are the Americans going to change their supply systems? Does this mean that some Canadian companies, whether they are big or small, are going to have to start doing layoffs? It means so much uncertainty. It means so much contingency planning. It means people might not be able to pay their mortgages and they don't know if they're going to be able to feed their kids. Tariffs are, you cannot underestimate the impact that tariffs have when it comes to upending people's livelihoods. And we talk about tariffs so frequently, I worry that we get numb to it in some situations. But these are real people. These are real families. These are real jobs.
And with that, folks, on that upbeat
on that happy note,
as we so
such
often
good
seem
feelings.
we so often seem to end the podcast on such high notes. It was a pleasure to speak with both of you. Mike, thank you so much for joining us. Your insight was crucial, and we're lucky we get you again next week.
Whether we're talking about tariffs or not.
Yeah, I bet we might be talking about that. I wonder if we're going to talk about the bridge. Is the bridge going to be open? Is the Gordie Howe Bridge going to be open? That is,
it's supposed to be, huh?
Okay, if there's one thing Canadians should be watching for this following week, we'll leave all the Canadians with some homework.
Folks who are listening, write in. Let us know what you think.
We'll do a poll. We'll do an Instagram poll. Please vote here.
Two blocks from the White House poll. I love it. This could be our latest segment.
As always, if you have something you'd like to ask or you have some feedback about what you're hearing, do you think the bridge will open? You can send an email to WashingtonPod, all one word, at CBC.ca. That is WashingtonPod at CBC.ca. Or you can leave us a comment on Spotify.
And if you like what you're hearing, spread the word. Tell a friend about this podcast and follow us on your favorite podcast app to never miss an episode.
All right, you two. Let's do it all again next week.
Thanks, guys.
Bye.